On the morning of May 5, 1983, Bruno Pulic, a San Mateo County patrolman, was conducting a routine inspection of Golden Gate Park's southern boundary when his flashlight beam caught something unusual, half buried in the undergrowth. A 55-gallon industrial drum, its top sealed with fresh concrete. Within hours, forensic teams would crack that barrel open to discover 3 bodies, each encased in a tomb of hardened cement. What began as a missing persons case would unravel into one of the Bay Area's most methodical and disturbing murder investigations, a case where the killer's former badge would become the key to understanding how he had hidden in plain sight for so long. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Anthony John Sully was born January 2, 1944, in San Francisco, a city then balancing its post-war boom with the emerging counterculture that would define the region. He spent his formative years in Millbrae, a suburb nestled between San Francisco and San Jose, where tract homes and new schools symbolize California's suburban promise. Sully graduated from a local high school in the early 1960s, a period when law enforcement careers carried prestige, when joining the police force meant stability, respect, and a pension. In 1965, he married Elizabeth Ann, a union that seemed to confirm the trajectory of an ordinary man building an ordinary life. But those who knew the couple later would recall a dynamic that never quite settled, a marriage marked by silences and tensions that friends attributed to the pressures of young adulthood. The following year, Sully applied to the Millbrae Police Department and was accepted. From 1966 to 1974, he served in patrol and post-service roles, tasks that required discipline, routine interactions with the public, and adherence to protocol. His record during those 8 years appeared clean, his evaluations positive, his colleagues describing him as reliable if somewhat distant. He was the kind of officer who did his job without drawing attention, someone who blended into the institutional fabric of a small suburban police force. But something was shifting beneath the surface. In 1969, Elizabeth Ann filed for divorce, citing 4 years of physical abuse. Court documents from that period, though sparse, indicate a pattern of escalating violence within the home, behavior that Sully had successfully concealed from his professional circle. The divorce proceedings were handled quietly, as many were in that era, particularly when one party was a police officer. There was no formal investigation into the allegations, no review by the department, no public record that might have flagged Sully as anything other than a man going through a difficult personal situation. In 1974, Sully married for a second time, this time to a woman named Donna. That marriage lasted only 15 months. Donna's divorce petition detailed constant physical assaults. A restraining order was issued barring Sully from approaching her, her child, or her relatives. She also recounted an incident that occurred after their separation, an event that would later be cited by psychologists as indicative of a profound lack of empathy. Following their split, Sully visited Donna's home and, in front of her daughter, systematically twisted the necks of the girl's pet ducklings, killing them one by one. He then told Donna, according to her testimony, that he could do the same to her child if she continued to resist him. The incident was reported, but no criminal charges were filed. Sully left the police department in 1974, the same year as his second divorce, though official records do not specify whether he resigned voluntarily or was encouraged to leave. What is clear is that by the late 1970s, Anthony Sully was operating outside the structure that had once defined him. He started his own business, working as an electrical and construction contractor, a trade that allowed him independence and irregular hours. He rented a hangar in Burlingame, a city adjacent to Millbrae, using the space as a warehouse for equipment and supplies. The hangar was large, isolated, and accessible only by a single service road, a location that provided both privacy and utility. It was during this period that Sully began to immerse himself in the Bay Area's underground economy, a world of pimps, prostitutes, and drug dealers that flourished in the early 1980s as the region's economy contracted and social safety nets frayed. He introduced himself as Jack, a street alias that allowed him to operate without the baggage of his real identity. Reports from acquaintances during this time describe Sully as someone who spent heavily, frequently using cocaine and other drugs, and who developed what some called an obsessive sexual appetite. In 1982, he invested several $1,000s, the source of which remains unclear, into funding an escort agency, a move that positioned him not just as a client, but as a financier and stakeholder in the sex trade. It was through this network that Sully met Tina Livingston, a 32-year-old woman who owned a local escort agency. Livingston operated in a gray zone, managing women who worked legally as escorts, but who often engaged in prostitution, a distinction that law enforcement at the time struggled to navigate. Sully and Livingston developed a transactional relationship, one based on mutual benefit and shared access to a vulnerable population. He provided money and protection, she provided access to women. It was a partnership that would prove deadly. In late 1982, one of Livingston's workers, 24-year-old Gloria Fravel, accumulated a debt of $500, a sum she could not repay. Fravel, who had a history of drug use, attempted to leave San Francisco to escape the debt, a decision that Livingston viewed as a betrayal. In early February 1983, Livingston, along with another sex worker named Kelly Angel Burns, located Fravel and convinced her to return to settle the matter. On February 5th, they brought Fravel to Sully's warehouse in Burlingame. What happened next was reconstructed through testimony given by Livingston and Burns, accounts that, while self-serving, aligned with the physical evidence later recovered. When Fravel arrived, Sully offered to forgive her debt in exchange for sex, an offer she refused. He responded by beating her, then dragging her to the back of the warehouse where he handcuffed her and suspended her from a ceiling beam using chains. Over the next 2 days, Sully kept Fravel in the warehouse, subjecting her to prolonged torture and sexual assault. Livingston and Burns remained on the premises, stationed in another section of the hangar, aware of what was occurring, but claiming later that they felt powerless to intervene. Fravel was drugged repeatedly with cocaine, a tactic that rendered her disoriented and compliant. On one occasion, Sully fashioned a hangman's noose from rope, placing it around her neck while she hung suspended, a theatrical element that suggested he derived satisfaction not just from the act, but from the ritual of control. On the second day, Fravel freed herself from the gag and began screaming. Livingston and Burns attempted to silence her but failed. Sully entered the room and strangled her with the rope. Believing her dead, he and Burns loaded her body into a car and drove east toward the foothills. But during the drive, Fravel regained consciousness. Sully stopped the car on the side of State Route 35, pulled an axe from the trunk, and struck her multiple times in the head, killing her. They left her body in a shallow ravine off the highway, where it was discovered by a passing motorist on February 7th. Investigators noted blunt force trauma to the skull and ligature marks around the neck, signs of both strangulation and subsequent violence. Sully reportedly kept a newspaper clipping of the discovery, telling associates he found it amusing that Fravel's body had been found by a butcher, a detail that later appeared in trial testimony as evidence of his detachment and lack of remorse. Within days of Fravel's murder, Sully contacted Livingston with a specific request. He wanted a woman who was not a prostitute, someone who would be less likely to be missed, but who would still agree to provide sexual services for money. Livingston identified 19-year-old Brenda Oakton, a roommate of one of her escorts who occasionally engaged in sex work under the alias Brenda Rule. Oakton had run away from her home in Huntington Beach in the early 1980s and had gravitated towards San Francisco's punk rock scene, a subculture that offered both community and anonymity. She was young, transient, and disconnected from her family, qualities that made her, in Sully's assessment, an ideal victim. In mid-February, Oakton was brought to the warehouse under the pretense of a paid encounter. Once inside, Sully shot her in the back of the head with a .38 caliber revolver, killing her instantly. The execution-style nature of the killing marked a shift in Sully's methodology, where torture gave way to expedience. Livingston, following Sully's instructions, spread a rumor among Oakton's friends that she had boarded a bus and left San Francisco, a story that delayed any formal missing persons report for weeks. Oakton's body would not be found for months, hidden in a location Sully had carefully selected. In early 1983, Sully had an argument with 24-year-old Michael Thomas, a pimp with a criminal record for robbery and drug possession, and Thomas's 20-year-old common-law wife, Phyllis Melendez, a prostitute with 5 prior arrests. The nature of the dispute is unclear. Some reports suggest it involved money, others that it stemmed from Thomas's perception that Sully was overstepping boundaries within the sex trade network. In April 1983, Sully invited the couple to his hangar, ostensibly to resolve the conflict. Shortly after they arrived, he shot both in the back of the head. The killings were methodical, each victim executed in turn, their bodies left in the warehouse while Sully prepared for disposal. It was at this point that Sully's approach became more calculated. He placed the bodies of Oakton, Thomas, and Melendez into 3 55-gallon industrial drums, containers he had stolen from a neighboring hangar. He filled each barrel with wet concrete, sealing the bodies inside as the mixture hardened. On April 29th, Sully and Burns transported the barrels to Golden Gate Park, rolling them down an embankment and covering them with brush. The location was remote, accessible only by service roads used by park maintenance crews, but it was not remote enough. On May 5th, patrolman Bruno Pulic discovered the first barrel. The discovery of the barrels initiated a forensic investigation that would become a case study in the emerging science of trace evidence. The barrels themselves were unremarkable, standard industrial containers used in construction and manufacturing, but they carried identifying marks. Investigators traced the serial numbers to a supply depot in South San Francisco, and from there, they identified the hangar from which they had been stolen. That hangar was located less than a quarter mile from Sully's warehouse. When technicians examined the barrel's surfaces, they found fingerprints clear and intact despite the rough texture of the metal. Those prints were run through the California Department of Justice's fingerprint database, a system that in 1983 was still largely manual, requiring technicians to compare inked impressions against physical cards filed by jurisdiction. The match came back within 72 hours. The prints belonged to Anthony John Sully, a former police officer with an address in Millbrae. Alongside Sully's prints, investigators found partial handprints in the dried concrete itself, impressions left when someone had smoothed the surface before it fully hardened. Those prints matched Kelly Angel Burns, a name that appeared in Millbrae PD records as an associate of Tina Livingston. The investigation now had 2 suspects and a probable third. On August 10, 1983, Sully contacted Barbara Searcy, a 22-year-old former girlfriend, offering her financial assistance. Searcy, who was struggling financially, agreed to meet him at the warehouse. When she arrived, Sully shot her in the back of the head with his .38 revolver. After the killing, Sully gave Searcy's clothes and personal belongings to Livingston as payment for a specific task. Livingston was to enter Searcy's apartment and erase the message Sully had left on her answering machine, the one in which he had invited her to meet him. But Livingston was unable to gain entry to the apartment, leaving the message intact. That recording would later become crucial evidence, a direct link between Sully and the victim in the hours before her death. Sully wrapped Searcy's body in transparent plastic sheeting, tied it with white cotton rope, and with Livingston's help, dragged the body behind his car along a service road near Woodside. He left it near the Pulgas Water Temple, a public landmark, where it was discovered on August 18th by a maintenance worker. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, but forensic pathologists were able to recover both the plastic sheeting and the rope, items that would later be matched to materials found in Sully's possession. Sully's final victim was 24-year-old Catherine Barrett, a known drug dealer whom he invited to the warehouse on August 27th, ostensibly to purchase 6 ounces of cocaine. Barrett arrived with the drugs, expecting a straightforward transaction. But Sully, along with 20-year-old Michael Anthony Francis, an associate he had recently recruited, attacked her. Francis would later testify that Sully stabbed Barrett 6 times in the chest with a knife, then struck her repeatedly with a sledgehammer, fracturing her skull. The attack was frenzied, lacking the cold efficiency of his previous killings, a deviation that suggested either desperation or a loss of control. On August 19th, Barrett's naked body, wrapped in plastic bags, was found on a street in South San Francisco's industrial district. The location was public, visible, a departure from Sully's earlier pattern of concealment. Investigators noted cigarette butts near the body, Benson & Hedges brand, a detail that would later prove significant. Sully was arrested on August 25, 1983, following a coordinated operation by the San Mateo County Sheriff's Department and the Millbrae Police Department. The arrest was executed early in the morning at his residence, a modest apartment in Millbrae where he lived alone. Detectives had already secured warrants to search both his home and his Burlingame warehouse, and within hours, forensic teams were combing through both locations. The warehouse yielded a trove of evidence: the stolen barrels, plastic sheeting with structural defects identical to those used to wrap Michael Thomas's body, white cotton rope that fiber analysis matched to the bindings on Barbara Searcy's corpse, and a pack of Benson & Hedges cigarettes whose batch number corresponded to the butts found near Catherine Barrett's body. In Sully's car, investigators found more plastic bags, rope fragments, and dried bloodstains that were later matched to multiple victims through early DNA typing methods. The accumulation of evidence was overwhelming, each item forming a link in a chain that connected Sully to every murder. The legal proceedings that followed were as complex as the investigation had been meticulous. In October 1983, Anthony Sully was formally charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty on all counts, a decision that set the stage for a trial that would span nearly 3 years. The delay was due in part to the forensic complexity of the case, which required expert testimony on fingerprint analysis, fiber matching, blood typing, and the relatively new science of psychological profiling. Prosecutors also needed to secure the cooperation of Tina Livingston, whose testimony was essential to reconstructing the timeline and methods of the murders. Livingston, facing charges of her own, agreed to a plea deal with the San Mateo County District Attorney's Office. In exchange for testifying against Sully, Burns, and Francis, she would plead guilty to negligent homicide, a lesser charge that carried a maximum sentence of 3 years. Her decision to cooperate was pragmatic. She understood that without her testimony, the prosecution's case would rely heavily on circumstantial evidence, and that by providing detailed accounts of each killing, she could secure a significantly reduced sentence. On June 3, 1986, after deliberating for 5 days, a jury found Anthony Sully guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was unanimous, supported by forensic evidence that included fingerprints, fiber analysis, blood typing, and the testimonies of Livingston, Burns, and Francis. Just 12 days later, on June 15th, Sully was sentenced to death by the presiding judge, who cited the aggravating factors of torture, premeditation, and multiple victims. After the sentence was announced, Sully delivered a 40-minute speech in which he proclaimed his innocence, claiming that he had been framed by Livingston and her associates, a narrative that the jury had already rejected. Tina Livingston was convicted in the summer of 1986 and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, but because she had been held in custody since her arrest in August 1983, she was released with time served. Her cooperation had earned her freedom, but it also marked her as an informant, a status that would follow her for the rest of her life. Michael Anthony Francis, convicted as an accomplice in the Catherine Barrett murder, was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Kelly Angel Burns, convicted in the murders of Michael Thomas, Phyllis Melendez, and Brenda Oakton, received the same sentence: life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Both Francis and Burns were transferred to separate California state prisons, where they would serve their sentences under close supervision. Anthony Sully was placed on death row at San Quentin State Prison, a facility that housed California's condemned prisoners in a unit known as East Block. His cell measured approximately 4 by 9 feet, furnished with a bed, toilet, and sink, conditions that were standard for death row inmates. Sully would spend 23 hours a day in that cell, allowed 1 hour of exercise in a small outdoor yard. Despite the severity of his crimes and the overwhelming evidence that had convicted him, Sully continued to assert his innocence. He filed formal requests for commutation of his death sentence on 2 occasions, first in 1991 and again in 2013, both of which were reviewed and denied by the California Board of Parole Hearings. He also sought a new trial, filing multiple appeals that challenged various aspects of his conviction, including the admissibility of certain forensic evidence and the reliability of witness testimony. Each appeal was reviewed by the California Court of Appeal and the California Supreme Court, and each was ultimately dismissed. The legal process, which spanned decades, reflected the thoroughness with which California's judicial system reviewed capital cases, but it also underscored the strength of the evidence against Sully. Michael Francis, serving his sentence at High Desert State Prison, became eligible for parole in 2004. His applications were denied multiple times due to repeated rule infractions and violent behavior while incarcerated, including a 1997 conviction for assaulting a fellow inmate. In 2020, Francis waived his right to a parole hearing, a decision that resulted in an automatic denial of parole for 5 years. Kelly Burns, by contrast, maintained a relatively clean disciplinary record during her incarceration. She participated in educational and vocational programs, earning a GED and completing courses in cosmetology and business administration. In 2016, after spending more than 33 years in prison, Burns was granted parole and released. Her release was met with mixed reactions. Some viewed it as evidence of the rehabilitative potential of the prison system. Others saw it as a miscarriage of justice given her role in the murders. In the years leading up to his death, Anthony Sully's health began to decline. He was diagnosed with an unspecified form of cancer, a condition that required ongoing medical treatment. By 2023, Sully's condition had deteriorated to the point where he was transferred from San Quentin to an off-site medical facility for end-of-life care. On the morning of September 8, 2023, at the age of 79, Anthony John Sully died of natural causes. His death was officially recorded by the Marin County coroner, who notified Kent Nielsen, the only person listed as Sully's emergency contact. Nielsen, a resident of Atascadero, California, had known Sully since 1969, when Nielsen was 16 years old and worked at a mobile service station in Millbrae that serviced patrol cars for the Millbrae Police Department. Sully, then a 25-year-old officer, had befriended the teenager, and though they drifted apart after Sully left the force in 1974, Nielsen reconnected with him in 2002 out of curiosity. Over the next 2 decades, Nielsen and his wife visited Sully regularly at San Quentin, exchanging hundreds of letters and cards. In a story broadcast by CBS in November 2023, Nielsen acknowledged that despite their many conversations, he had never asked Sully why he committed the murders. He expressed regret for that omission, noting that he believed Sully would have answered honestly if asked. The case of Anthony Sully raises enduring questions about the nature of violence, the limits of institutional oversight, and the mechanisms by which individuals who occupy positions of trust can exploit those positions to commit atrocities. Sully was not an outsider. He was a police officer, a man trained to uphold the law, someone who understood investigative procedures and evidence collection. His knowledge of law enforcement protocols likely informed his methods, from the selection of isolated locations to the careful disposal of bodies, in ways designed to delay discovery. The fact that he operated undetected for months, despite a pattern of escalating violence, speaks to both the limitations of 1980s forensic technology and the vulnerability of marginalized populations. Sully's victims were sex workers, pimps, and individuals on the periphery of society, people whose disappearances were less likely to trigger immediate investigation, whose connections to law enforcement were often adversarial rather than protective. This dynamic, in which certain lives are deemed less worthy of scrutiny, is a recurring theme in true crime history, one that continues to resonate today. Psychologists who reviewed the case have suggested that Sully exhibited traits consistent with psychopathy, including a lack of empathy, a need for control and a capacity for instrumental violence. Violence committed not out of passion, but as a means to an end. The torture, the meticulous planning, the ritualistic elements all point to someone who derives satisfaction not just from the act of killing, but from the exertion of absolute power over another person. Yet even with this framework, questions remain. Was Sully's behavior the result of innate pathology, or was it shaped by experiences, traumas, or environmental factors that we can only glimpse through court records and second-hand accounts? The answer, as is often the case in criminal psychology, is likely a combination of both, a confluence of predisposition and circumstance that created a man capable of extraordinary cruelty. The legacy of the Anthony Sully case extends beyond the individual crimes. It prompted changes in how California law enforcement handled cases involving transient populations and sex workers, leading to the establishment of protocols that emphasized timely investigation of missing persons reports regardless of the victim's background. It also contributed to the development of forensic techniques that are now standard in homicide investigations, including the systematic collection and comparison of trace evidence such as fibers, fingerprints, and biological material. The case demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation, as the successful prosecution of Sully required coordination between local police departments, the county sheriff's office, the district attorney, and state-level forensic labs. In the decades since, the Bay Area has seen significant changes in its approach to sex work, drug policy, and the treatment of marginalized communities, changes driven in part by the recognition that legal and social vulnerability creates opportunities for exploitation and violence. The women and men who died at Sully's hands were not just victims of one man's pathology. They were casualties of a system that failed to protect them, a system that is still evolving, still struggling to balance enforcement with empathy, justice with compassion. And so, the story of Anthony John Sully endures not as a cautionary tale about monsters lurking in the shadows, but as a reminder that the most dangerous individuals are often those who walk among us, those who wear badges and uniforms, those who know how to hide in plain sight. The question is not whether such people exist, but how we identify them, how we hold them accountable, and how we build systems that prevent the vulnerable from becoming victims. These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions we must continue to ask.